Hello friends, today we will discuss the topic desertification. The main focus of the topic will be on the concept of the desertification, categories and causes of desertification, attribution and solution of desertification, knowledge gaps and key uncertainties, and we will discuss on the future projections regarding the prevention of desertification. Dear students, as global temperatures rise and the human population expands, more of the planet is vulnerable to desertification. The permanent degradation of the land that was once arable. While interpretations of the term desertification vary, the concern centers on human caused land degradation in areas with low or variable rainfall known as drylands, that is arid, semi-arid and subhumid lands. These drylands account for more than 40% of the world's terrestrial surface area. While land degradation has occurred throughout history, the pace has accelerated, that is reaching to 30 to 35 times the historical rate according to the United Nations. This degradation tends to be driven by several factors including urbanization, mining, farming and ranching. Dear students, climate change also plays a significant role, raising the risk of drought causing desertification, a process of land degradation that makes fertile land desert. What are deserts? A wide, dry, barren place, usually with sandy or rocky soil and little or no vegetation. Water lost to evaporation and transpiration in the desert exceeds the precipitation levels. Most deserts average less than 25 centimeters of rainfall per year, concentrated in short local bursts. If we talk about the historical perspectives, the world's most noted deserts have been formed by natural processes interacting over long intervals of time. During most of these times, deserts have grown and shrunk independently of human activities. Paleodeserts are large sand seas now, inactive because they are stabilized by vegetation, some extending beyond the present margins of core deserts such as the Sahara, the largest hot desert. Historical evidence shows that a serious and extensive land deterioration occurring several centuries ago in arid regions had three centers: the Mediterranean, the Mesopotamian Valley and the Loess Plateau of the China, where population was dense. The earliest known discussion of the topic arose soon after the French colonization of West Africa, when Comité de Lourdes commissioned a study on detachment progressive to explore the prehistoric expansion of the Sahara Desert. The modern study of desertification emerged from the study of 1980s drought in the Sahel. The risk of desertification is widespread and spans more than 100 countries, hitting some of the poorest and most vulnerable populations. The hardest, since subsistence farming is common across many of the affected regions. More than 75% of the Earth's land area is already degraded according to the European Commission's World Atlas of Desertification, and more than 90% could become contaminated by 2050. For example, the drivers of the land degradation vary with different locations and causes often overlap with each other. In the regions of Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan surrounding the Aral Sea, excessive use of the water for agriculture irrigation has been a primary culprit in causing the sea to shrink, leaving behind a saline desert. The prospect of climate change and warmer average temperatures could amplify these effects. Dear students, from the above perspective, desertification can be described as a type of land degradation in dry lands in which biological productivity is lost due to natural processes or induced by human activities, whereby fertile areas become increasingly arider. It is the spread of the arid regions caused by a variety of factors such as through climate change, particularly the current global warming, and the overexploitation of soil through human activity. Desertification is a significant global ecological and environmental problem with far-reaching socio-economic and political consequences. There are, however, various types of desertification, like light desertification. In this type of desertification, very slight damage occurs in vegetation cover and soil. This damage does not affect the biological capacity of the environment and can be neglected. Second, moderate type of desertification. A medium degree of damage of vegetation cover occurs and formation of small dunes and salinization of the soil, which reduces production by 10 to 25%. Third, severe desertification. In this type, spreading of weeds and unwanted shrubs in the pasture at the expense of desirable and wanted species occurs, as well as increasing of the erosion activity, which affects the vegetation cover and reduces production up to 50%. Then very severe desertification. It is the most severe type of desertification wherein the composition of active naked great dunes occurs and formation of many groves and valleys and the salinization of the soil, which leads to the soil degradation. Dear students, now we will be discussing the causes of desertification. Climate change and human activity can be seen as the two leading causes of desertification. There are, however, four major causes of desertification. First, drought. A long period without rainfall causes crops to die. Second, overgrazing. Too many animals that are grazing on the land. The vegetation fails to grow and the soil is exposed to rain and wind. Third, overcultivation. Many crops being grown on the land year after year, no rotation of crops and take all the nutrients from the soil. The soil becomes infertile and nothing can grow. Fourth, removal of trees for fuel and shelter. There are few trees in the desert and their roots hold the soil together. When the trees are removed for firewood or to build the shelter, the roots die and the soil becomes loose to lead to desertification. Now we will be talking about the effects of desertification. Desertification is a result of complex interactions within coupled social ecological system. Thus, the relative contributions of climatic, anthropogenic and other drivers of the desertification vary depending on specific socio-economic and ecological contexts. The high natural climate variability in dryland regions is a significant cause of vegetation change, but does not necessarily imply degradation. Drought is not degradation, as the land productivity may return entirely once the drought ends. However, if deficits increase in frequency, intensity and duration, there may overwhelm the vegetation's ability to recover. First, impacts on ecosystems and their services in drylands. As per the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment 2005, that proposed four classes of ecosystem services like provisioning, regulating, supporting and cultural services. These ecosystem services in drylands are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change due to high variability in either the temperature, precipitation and soil fertility. So, there is high confidence that desertification processes such as soil erosion, secondary salinization and overgrazing have negatively impacted provisioning ecosystem services in drylands, particularly food and fodder production. Dear students, increase in temperature can have a direct impact on animals in the form of increased physiological stress, increased water requirements for drinking and cooling, a decrease in the production of the milk, meat and eggs, increased stress during the conception and reproduction, or an increase in the seasonal diseases and epidemics. Furthermore, the precipitation by affecting soil moisture content is considered to be the principal determinant of the capacity of drylands to sequester carbon. Dear friends, when desertification reduces vegetation cover, this alters the soil surface, affecting the albedo and the water balance. Dust storms also impact crop yields by reducing the quantity of water available for irrigation. They can decrease the storage capacity of reservoirs by siltation and block convenience canals. Now, we will be talking on the impacts of the desertification on biodiversity. First, we will be talking about the effects on plant biodiversity. Over 20% of the global plant biodiversity centers are located within drylands. Plant species situated within these areas are characterized by high genetic diversity within the populations. The plant species within these ecosystems are often highly threatened by climate change and desertification. Increasing aridity raises the risk of extinction of some plant species, especially those that are already threatened due to small populations or restricted habitats. Desertification, including through land use change, already contributed to the loss of biodiversity across drylands. For example, species richness decreased from 234 species in 1978 to 95 in 2011, following long periods of drought and human-driven degradation on the steppe land of southwestern Algeria. Now, the wildlife biodiversity. Dear students, dryland ecosystems have high levels of faunal diversity and endemism. Over 30% of the endemic bird areas are located within these regions, which is also home to 25% of the vertebrate species. Yet, many species within drylands are threatened with extinction. Habitat degradation and desertification are generally associated with biodiversity loss. The grazing value of the land declines with both a reduction in vegetation cover and shrub encroachment, with the former being more detrimental to native vertebrates. Now, the impacts of desertification on socio-economic systems. Combined impacts of the desertification and climate change on socio-economic development in drylands are complex. The impacts of the desertification and climate change are difficult to isolate from the effects of other socio-economic, institutional and political factors. However, there is high confidence that climate change will accelerate the vulnerability of dryland populations to desertification, and the combination of pressures coming from the climate change and desertification will diminish opportunities for reducing poverty, enhancing food and nutritional security, empowering women, reducing disease burden, and improving access to water and sanitation. Dear students, desertification is embedded in Sustainable Development Goals 15 and climate change is under Sustainable Development Goal 13. The high confidence and high magnitude impacts depicted for these Sustainable Development Goals indicate that the interaction between the desertification and climate change strongly affect the achievements of the targets of Sustainable Development Goals 13 and 15. Pointing at the need for the coordination of policy actions on land degradation neutrality and mitigation and adaptation to climate change. Now, we will be talking on the impacts of desertification on poverty. Climate change has a high potential to contribute to poverty, mainly through the risks coming from extreme weather events. However, the evidence rigorously attributing changes in the observed poverty to climate change impacts is currently not available. At least 90% of the inhabitants of drylands live in developing countries where they also suffer from poor economic and social conditions. This situation is enhanced by land degradation because of the reduction in productivity, the precariousness of living conditions and the difficulty of access to resources and opportunities. Many underdeveloped countries are affected by overgrazing, land exhaustion and overdrafting of groundwater due to pressures to exploit marginal drylands for farming. Decision makers are understandably averse to invest in arid zones with low potential. This absence of investment contributes to the marginalization of these zones. When unfavorable agroclimatic conditions are combined with an absence of infrastructure and access to markets, as well as poorly adapted production techniques and an underfed and undereducated population, most such zones are excluded from development. Dear students, desertification often causes rural lands to become unable to support the same sized populations that previously lived there. This results in mass migrations out of rural areas and into urban areas. We call it urbanizations, particularly in Africa. These migrations into the cities often cause large number of unemployed people who end up living in slums. For example, in Mongolia, the land is 90% fragile dryland, which causes many herders to migrate to the city for work. With very limited resource, the herders that stay in the dryland graze very carefully in order to preserve the land. With the increasing population of Mongolia, it is very difficult to stay a herder for a long. The number of these environmental refugees growing every year, with projections for sub-Saharan Africa showing a probable increase from 14 million in 2010 to nearly 200 million by 2050. This presents a future crisis for the region, as neighboring nations do not always have the ability to support large populations of refugees. Dear students, agriculture is a main source of income for many desert communities. The increase in desertification in these regions have degraded the land to such an extent where people can no longer productively farm and make a profit. This has negatively impacted the economy and increased poverty rates. There is, however, increased global advocacy to combat desertification and restore affected lands, such as the United Nations Sustainable Goal 15, amongst the other countermeasures. Now, we will be talking about the impacts on food and nutritional insecurity. Dear students, about 821 million people globally were food insecure in 2017, of whom 63% in Asia, 31% in Africa and 5% in Latin America and the Caribbean. The global number of food insecure people rose by 37 million since 2014. This changing climate variability combined with a lack of climate resilience was suggested as a critical driver of this increase. The primary mechanism through which climate change and desertification affect food security is through their impacts on agriculture productivity. There is a robust evidence pointing to the adverse effects of climate change on crop yields in dryland areas. Climate change and desertification are not the sole drivers of a food insecurity. Still, especially in the areas with high dependence on agriculture, they are among the main contributors. Now, we will be talking about the impacts of this desertification on human health through dust storms. Dear students, the frequency and intensity of dust storms are increasing due to the land use and land cover changes and climate related factors, particularly in some regions of the world such as the Arabian Peninsula. Dust storms transport particulate matter, pollutants, pathogens and potential allergens that are dangerous for human health over long distances. The health effects of the dust storms are most considerable in areas near their origin, primarily the Sahara Desert, followed by Central and Eastern Asia, the Middle East and Australia. Now, dear students, we will be talking about the impacts of desertification on water scarcity and use. Dear students, reduced water retention capacity of a degraded soils amplifies floods, reinforces degradation processes through soil erosion and reduces annual intake of water to aquifers, increasing existing water scarcities. Reduced vegetation cover and more intense dust storms were found to intensify droughts. Now, dear students, what are the solutions to desertification? Desertification is recognized as a significant threat to biodiversity. Some countries have developed biodiversity action plans to counter its effects, particularly concerning the protection of endangered flora and fauna. Various factors will help us to combat the desertification, like policy change related to how people can farm. In countries where policy change will be enforced on those in the country, policy change related to how often people can farm, how much they can farm on certain areas could be put into place to help reduce the problems that are often associated with farming and desertification. Second, policy change to other types of land use. If people are using land to get natural resources or they are developing it for people to live on, then the policies that govern them should be ones that will help the land to thrive instead of allowing them to harm the land further. The policy change could be sweeping or they could be depending on the type of land use at hand. Third, education in developing countries. Dear students, education is an incredibly important tool that needs to be utilized to help people to understand the best way to use the land they are farming on. By educating them on sustainable practices, more land will be saved from becoming desert. Fourth, technological advances. As we know, research is the key to overcome most of our environmental problems, and it applies to desertification also. In some cases, it isn't easy to try and prevent desertification from happening. advancements could help us find more ways to avoid the issue from becoming an epidemic. Fifth, restricting mining practices. Dear friends, mining often implies the destruction of large areas of land. Therefore, it should be regulated by governments to keep the nature reserves intact and protect the natural habitats of many animals and plants. Thus, less land will be arid and the desertification issue can be mitigated to a certain extent. Sixth is the putting together rehabilitation efforts. There are some ways that we can go back and rehabilitate the land that we already pushed into desertification. It just takes some investment of time and money. By putting these together, we can prevent the issue from becoming even more widespread in the areas that have already been affected by one of the following. First, reforestation. Reforestation is the natural or intentional restocking of existing forests and woodlands that have been depleted, usually through deforestation. Reforestation can be used to improve the quality of a human life by soaking up pollution and dust from the air, rebuild natural habitats and ecosystems, mitigate global warming since forests facilitate biosequestration of atmospheric carbon dioxide and harvest for resources. Second, fixation of soil. Fixing the soil is often done through the use of shelter belts, woodlots and windbreaks. Windbreaks are made from trees and bushes and are used to reduce soil erosion and evapotranspiration. Some soils, for example clay, due to lack of water can become consolidated rather than porous, as in the case of sandy soils. Some techniques are tillage that are often used to allow the planting of crops settle. The leguminous plants which extract nitrogen from the air and fixes it in the soil, and food crops or trees as grains, barley, beans and dates are the most important. Now dear students, we will be talking about contour trenching. Contour trenching is an agriculture technique that can be easily applied in arid sub-areas to allow for water and soil conservation and to increase agriculture production. This involves the digging of 150 meter long, 1 meter deep trenches in the soil. The channels are made parallel to the height lines of the landscape, preventing the water from flowing within the tracks and causing erosion. Stone walls are placed around the trench to prevent the channels from closing up again. Fourth one is farmer managed natural regeneration. Dear students, this technique has produced successful results for desert reclamation. The process involves enabling native sprouting tree growth through selective pruning of sharp shoots. The residue from pruned trees can be used to provide mulching for fields, thus increasing soil water retention and reducing evaporation. Fifth one is managed grazing, a method proposed to restore grasslands by using fences with many small paddocks and moving herds from one paddock to another after a day or two to mimic natural grazers and allowing the grass to grow optimally. Dear students, now we will be talking on the knowledge gaps and critical uncertainties regarding desertification. Desertification has been studied for decades and different drivers of the desertification have been described, classified and are generally understood. However, there are knowledge gaps on the extent and severity of the desertification at global, regional and local scales. Overall, improved estimation and mapping of areas undergoing desertification is needed. This requires a combination of rapidly expanding sources of remotely sensed data, grounded observation and new modeling approaches. Despite numerous relevant studies, consistent indicators for attributing desertification to climatic or human causes still lack due to methodological shortcomings. Dear students, climate change impacts on dust and sandstorm activity remain a critical gap. Besides the effects of dust and sandstorms on human welfare, ecosystems and crops. Now, we will be talking about the future projections about desertification. Future projections of combined impacts of desertification and climate change on ecosystem services, fauna and flora are lacking. Even though this topic is a considerable social importance, available information is mostly on a separate individual impacts of either climate change or desertification. Response to desertification are species specific and mechanistic models are not yet available to accurately predict individual species response to the many factors that are associated with desertification under changing climate. However, the information on the future interactions between the environment and the desertification beyond changes in the aridity index are lacking. The knowledge of future climate change impacts on such desertification processes as soil erosion, salinization and nutrient depletion remains limited both at the global and at the national levels. Further research to develop the technologies and innovations needed to combat desertification is required. Still, it is also essential to gain a better understanding of the reasons for the observed low adoption of available innovations to improve adoption rates. Desertification under a changing climate has a high potential to increase poverty, mainly through the risks coming from the extreme weather events. Now friends, we can conclude today's lecture with this note that the conservation of a land or soil is need of the hour. Otherwise, more and more land is converted into deserts that is detrimental for our future. With this, we conclude today's lecture. Hope you have understood well. Thank you.